Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we endeavour to bring you the very best content with regards looking at these old school vintage scrambles and motocross machines from back in the day. Now, we're currently in the process of covering the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this next video is, of course, episode 7 of possibly 8 or even 9 videos that we're going to be showing you from this year's show. So we're not going to mess about, and we're going to dive straight into our next machine. So thanks once more for coming back to check out more old classics from the 2023 Telford show, and in sharp contrast to the immaculate machines that we've seen in the previous 6 episodes, we're now going to start part 7 and take a look at one of the not so glamorous examples, but nonetheless quite an original bike. And so this is Matt Powell's 1979 Cotton EMX, which I'm told is about to undergo a full restoration just shortly. So I suspect that Matt was wanting us all to have a look at his bike in its 44-year-old patina before he dismembers the bike for its refurbishment and hopefully total transformation. But I must say, even although this bike is now 44 years old, it still appears to have many of its stock original parts bolted onto the bike. Now, as you're aware, these cotton-framed EMXs were powered by a Rotax 2-stroke motor, and this one here is a 370 variant, which looks like it's had quite a hard life, but of course, hopefully by the time that Matt's finished with its restoration, it'll all be as good as new once again. And these cotton EMXs were of course the brainchild of Mike Etoff, who was the man responsible for designing those superb chassis for Alan Cluse's CCM bikes back in the 1970s. But then Mike left CCM to start up his own off-road bike building venture when he created EMC, or Etoff Motocross Components. But of course Mike later had to then change the company's trading name to EMX when another company was already using EMC as a trading name, and there was a bit of a legal wrangle going on with the rights to use that EMC prefix. But nevertheless, it's quite good to see another example of these EMXs, because basically they were a bit of a kit bike, because Mike Etoff did design and build the frames, and he also manufactured the motor's expansion chambers. But other than that, all of the other parts that he needed to build the bike were all bought in from outside suppliers, because Mike thought that this was a much better way to keep his costs down rather than tooling up his own factory to make the parts themselves. And actually, for their time, these bikes were still quite a decent package with that light Etoff chassis and the Rotax motors, although the earlier EMCs did have German Sachs motors fitted at that time. But who knows, maybe next year we'll be able to see Matt's EMX all blinged up and back here at the show in 2024. But once again, another quite original old bike from 1979, a lovely cotton EMX 370. Although I do suspect that Matt will be very happy if his 1979 EMX turns out as good as this example from Rob Hughes, which is a 1977 EMC 250, which is of course one of the earlier cotton EMCs with that beautiful German Sachs two-stroke powered motor. Now this bike here is, as I said, belongs to Rob Hughes, who of course had that lovely collection of CCMs at the show, and this bike here was restored by Rob's ace mechanic Alec Middleton. Now I've already covered this bike in another video here on my YouTube channel some time ago, which is certainly worth a look if you're interested, because this is a fantastic example of a quite rare machine. But this German Sachs 250 motor was certainly a sweet little two-stroke piston port power plant that had a 7-speed gearbox that was made up of a complex arrangement of gear shafts that made up that 7-speed box. But this very light two-stroke motor was well suited to Mike Etoff's light steel nickel-plated chassis, and these Sachs engines, as I said, were fitted onto the earlier cotton EMCs, whereby on Matt Powell's 1979 bike that we just had a look at was fitted with the later Austrian-made Rotax engine. Now the front suspension was yet another one of the components that Mike Etoff bought in to build these bikes, and these were of course Italian Marzocchi suspension units here at the front, with of course more European parts used on the front brake as well, with this time using Czechoslovakian CZ front hubs. But every single component on this bike is as it was for 1977, and it's certainly a credit to Alec Middleton, the bike's builder, for making such a fantastic job of its restoration. And as I said, there's already a more comprehensive and detailed video on the build of this bike on my channel, so make sure that you have a look at that if you want to know more about this lovely 1977 250 EMC. And so another one of the nice machines that were tightly packed in to the main hall at the show was this immaculate 1967 Husqvarna 360 Viking. And once again, this bike has been restored to almost better than brand new condition. And for me, personally speaking, this was another of the more outstanding machines that were on display. But this beautiful specimen was a nut and bolt restoration that was all done by Peter Saunders, who it said built this bike from just boxes of old Husqvarna spare parts. But the bike is still authentic because it does have a pair of matching frame and engine numbers, so it's still the same chassis and motor that was mated up at the Husqvarna factory back in 1967. But these 360 Vikings did sell in decent numbers in this year, both at home and overseas, and at this time it was Brian Leask who was the official importer of these Husqvarnas into the UK at that time, and riders all over the country were just clamouring to get their hands on one of these Swedish Huskies to replace their outdated British-made Greaves, Dots and other British-made machines that were previously dominating the sport. And if you're of a certain age, you may remember legendary British rider Alan Clough, who won the British 250 Motocross Championship on a Husqvarna, and he was also runner-up in the big bike 500 class as well. So you can see that these two-stroke Huskies were also very competitive here in the UK as well as abroad. But this 360 Viking model was of course the forerunner of that legendary 400 cross Husky machine that won world motocross titles for the likes of the great Swedish star Bengt Aberg in 1969 and 1970. And as I said, this was yet another of those very nice bikes that you wish you could have wheeled out into the open so that you could get a much better look around it and take some decent pictures and video footage. But as I said, in this part of the main hall was where all the immaculate motorcycle specimens were all hidden. It's just that you couldn't gain access to any of them because most of the time they were too tightly packed together or cordoned off to keep spectators away. But I have to say, the finish on this bike is certainly a credit to the bike building skills of Peter Saunders, who's conjured up a lovely classic from just boxes of rusty old Husqvarna dirt bike parts. And in the condition that this bike's in now, I wouldn't be surprised if it actually won a prize or two when the concourse judging took place later in the day. But without doubt, a very rare and beautiful bike from Peter Saunders, his 1967 360 Viking, and for me personally, certainly one of the more outstanding bikes that I came across over the 2 days of the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. But once again, Peter's bike here was just typical of the quality of machines that were on display. And so our next featured bike is the model that went on to replace our 360 Viking, and this next machine here is a 1971 400 cross Husqvarna, and this featured bike was restored by Husky bike specialist Will Bennett in 2013, and it's said that since then this bike has been stored in a garage for at least the last 10 years or so, but the bike is now currently owned by Alan Wright. But once more, this was another one of the very nice machines that were offered up for sale over the course of the weekend, and Alan was selling off his prize possession for only 12,000 of our finest British pounds. And to be fair, it certainly looked like Alan had spent every penny of that 12 grand on the bike, because again, it's another stunning restoration of one of these iconic 400 cross Husqvarna motorcycles. But I'm sure you already know that these 400 cross Huskies were elevated to almost legendary status when some were seen as part of Bruce Brown's epic movie documentary on any Sunday, when the likes of Hollywood film star Steve McQueen was seen riding a similar bike in that now famous movie. But as you can see, quite a sizable fuel tank on these 400 cross bikes, and usually if you gas the bike up, this fuel cell would still store enough fuel to keep feeding that 400 Husky motor on even some of the longest scrambles or even enduro races. But as we move on to the Husky's 400 motor, which was a decent engine for its day, and it worked very well inside that light chrome moly steel chassis. But as you can see, these 400 cross models had this up and over the top of the engine exhaust system, which naturally kept the pipe away from any debris that was thrown up from the track. So these tended not to suffer the same fate as pipes that ran underneath the chassis. But it was basically a one-piece unit that was tucked quite neatly onto this left-hand side of the bike, which occasionally was very handy if you wanted to warm up the inside of your leg on a cold day. Now, up at the front end of our Husky cross, it was usually Husqvarna's own manufactured suspension units that were fitted to these bikes in the early 1970s. And again, although these were pretty basic in their design, they still gave the rider about 6 inches of travel at the front ends. But again, because of their time period, these forks had little scope in the way of adjustment or tuning. But basically, this is what you had to work with back in the day. But if my aging memory still serves me right, I think it would have been a pair of the old school girdling dampers on these 400s back in the early 1970s. And I must say that these ones that are fitted onto Alan's bike certainly look like the real deal from that period. But these again were pretty basic in their design, and you often wonder how some of those old legends from the past actually managed to cope with such limited movement here at the back. But as I said, these were the suspension technologies of their time. The rear stoppers on our Swedish 400 were your old school drum brakes, which is nothing more than you'd expect on any off-road motorcycle in that early 1970s period. But in terms of their stopping power, they were quite adequate at best. But then again, this 400 was certainly a lot lighter than many of its other big bore racers of that year. Now, to fuel that thirsty two-stroke engine, a good reliable Bing carburetor was employed to feed the motor with its gas, and the 400 Cross's air filter was certainly one of the easiest to access for cleaning and maintenance. And as I recall, it was a paper type cartridge filter that was inside this can, and just by simply removing these 3 simple nuts, it then gave you immediate access to change it or perform any other routine maintenance that was required. Although in terms of a bit of comfort between the bumps, you certainly can't knock a Husqvarna seat for a decent place to rest your backside on when the going got rough. And even for the early 1970s, these Husky race seats were still among some of the best in their racing class. But certainly, yet again, another one of the superb specimens from this year's Telford show, and certainly a credit to the bike's builder, Will Bennett, who did all of the work on this bike back in 2013. Now, whether the bike actually got sold on the day, I don't know, but what a lovely example to add to anyone's motorcycle collection. And so, just to conclude this Part 7 edition from the Telford Dirt Bike Show, we're going to finish off by taking a look at a couple of nice Honda CR250s that were on display on the Elderfield Motorcycles stand. And again, the guys at Elderfield Motorcycles specialise in parts and services for these old Honda Red Rockets, and these 2 examples here were sporting some of their trick and original parts that they supply for these bikes. Now, I did take a good look at both of these bikes quite close up, and I must say, although the bikes aren't your run-of-the-mill stock 1970s Red Rockets, the parts that these guys make and then fit onto these bikes certainly make what was already a decent machine in its stock standard trim into these fantastic twin shock eligible 250 race bikes. But as far as I'm aware, most of the bikes' chassis and their swing arms are normally left well alone, although the Elderfields can more or less improve or upgrade much of what's left on these bikes, which is quite a lot, as you can see. Now, firstly, as we look at the rear of this bike, a quality pair of YSS piggyback suspension units have been bolted in place, which is a massive improvement on the original Honda shocks from the late 1970s. And these YSS parts are, of course, all manufactured right here in the UK. So again, yet another good reason to fit them onto your CR250 Elsinore Red Rocket. And in contrast to the bike's rear end, we move on to the front of our Honda. Now, I don't think these forks are the original Honda items that would have been bolted onto these Red Rockets in the late 1970s, because it looks like we've got a pair of Fox factory units in their place. But this alloy front brake backplate looks like one of those CNC machine parts that the Elderfield guys supply for these bikes. And again, here on the rear brake, we have a bit more bling alloy, again manufactured by the Elderfield CNC machine in this replacement brake backplate. But also this rear brake torque arm as well, which once more are both upgrades and quality improvements over the stock original Honda items. But as we move along onto the bike's transmission side, we have a replacement gear shifter from Hammerhead Designs, and it also looks like the original skinny Honda foot pegs have also been upgraded to these much wider and, of course, much better and higher quality items. But it's certainly no surprise to see a change of exhaust expansion chamber on our 70s Red Rocket, and this time the stock Honda items being changed for this top quality Fresco expansion chamber, which has been mated once again to this Fresco alloy tailpipe at the back. But both of these parts will be better and, of course, much lighter than the 1970s originals. Once again, custom made bespoke graphics on that new seat, using, of course, a replacement cover other than the traditional Honda item, and once more graphics added to the fuel tank as well. And whether these graphics were actually made for a particular customer or maybe just a showpiece for the company, I don't know, but it certainly without doubt adds a little bit of originality and uniqueness to what was in its stock trim a pretty bland motorcycle by Honda. Although, as I said, not a pair of original Honda Red Rockets, but just a small sample of the kind of quality workmanship that the guys at Elderfield produced, not only on these old Honda twin shockers, but of course other machines as well. So again, they're another very good contact to keep on your phone or on your computer, just in case you need parts or even engine services for your old Honda Red Rocket. And as you can see, both of these bikes were offered for sale on the day of the show. So if you think you might be in the market for one of these Red Rocket twin shockers, then why not just give the guys at Elderfield Motorcycles a quick bell. But we still have quite a few more bikes to feature from this year's Telford Dirt Bike Show, and coming up in part 8, these are just a couple of the bikes we'll be including, starting with this beautifully restored 1979 GS KTM 125, which was on display and advertised for sale at a very good price, I thought. And we'll also be taking a look at Chris Chell's multi-championship winning 1971 Shenny BSA, which is another lovely old classic racer. So make sure that you join me again very soon as we check out more vintage motorcycles from the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. So until the next time, it's goodbye for now.